Okay, we are going to continue our discussion on distribution system planning. We've got another wonderful panel lined up. Alan Cooke, research economist for PNNL. Alan, there you are. Sorry. How are you? Jereme Kent, general manager and CEO of One Energy Enterprises. And Aaron Snyder, director of grid technology consulting for EnerNex. Alan, we are going to start with you. Thank you.
Chairman Hawk, commissioners and staff, thank you for inviting me back to talk about this. We were asked to talk about how the evolving grid will impact distribution planning. So with that as a goal, I'll lay out some information in a minute or two. First of all, I just want to mention that this paper was co-written by Juliet Homer. Juliet and I worked with people from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and NREL to put together a report that I'll talk about in just a minute. That's where most of my information is coming from today. So here's my agenda. I want to start by giving you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to talk about the role of the distribution utility in this evolving grid, and finally talk about distribution planning and some considerations. Now, I must say that a lot of the things that I was going to talk about today have been talked about, so I'm going to skip some of that stuff, and in the process, it'll probably end up having Christina waving at me saying I've been here for 30 minutes, but we're going to try to do it that way. So in the back of my slide deck, I put 10 slides that I don't plan to talk about today. They're just background information and some extra information for you, but 2 of them talk about the grid modernization program, the laboratory consortium. I presented these last year when I was here, so I don't feel like going back over them again, but in case you want to look at that, it's in the back of my slide deck. Juliet and I and some other people wrote a report called The State Engagement in Electric Distribution Planning. We looked at the 5 states that, at that time anyway, we were considering to be the states that were really leading the pack in terms of grid modernization and in terms of getting DERs into place in the field. That would be Hawaii, California, New York, Massachusetts, and Minnesota. We also looked at 11 other states. I think there's a total of 16 in there. And a lot of my material, in fact, most of my material is drawn from what's in that report. So one more thing about the report, and then I'm going to move into this presentation. This is kind of a cheat sheet. If there are things that you're interested in, like, say, locational net benefits analysis, if you look at this grid, there are a couple of states that were really into that analysis, and you can hop straight to California or New York, and you can look at what they were doing in the way of locational net benefits analysis. Okay, so to start with, the question is, in my mind, what is this evolving grid even going to look like? What's the distribution utility going to be doing in that evolving grid? So I started by looking at the goals and the vision statements and the objectives that these states have put on the table to guide their grid modernization programs, and looked for some commonalities, some threads that went through these. And this is what I came up with. So the first one is really what we were hearing from the utility folks this morning or early this afternoon, which is continued safe, reliable operation of the distribution grid. I mean, that's still a bedrock, that's still a core function here. Enabling state to meet to meet its energy policy goals. A lot of these states have specific goals, like Rhode Island, for example, a fairly small state, wants to integrate 1,000 megawatts of renewables by, I think it was 2020, which is a pretty big goal. So they're looking at this grid modernization as one of the things that help them to do that. Now, I'm not aware of Ohio having such a goal as a state, but you can look at other goals as well. And maybe, quite frankly, if reliability or resilience is a goal, we keep talking about this grid modernization effort as being something that amps up reliability and resilience. So, fill in your own goal there. So some other things, greater system efficiency, new products, more choices for customers. I think that seems to be, if it's not the number one goal, it's right up there at the top of the stack in all these states that have been working on grid modernization. So customer choice is a big one. Getting information out to customers, I'm going to talk a lot about that today. And of course, that one that we've heard a lot about as well, which is cybersecurity, having a secure, open, interoperable utility network. So these seem to be the goals that this distribution system is going to have to pursue. So with this in mind, I then ask the question of, okay, so what are they going to be doing? How is this going to affect distribution planning? Well, first, the distribution planning they've been doing all along, they're still going to need to do. You know, what was described this morning as blocking and tackling, you're still going to have to do the blocking and tackling. But we're going to be adding to that, one of which is identifying the technologies or the functions needed to enable greater DER penetration, and then integrating it, and value maximization. I'm going to come back to value maximization quite heavily as I go through this. So some of this is going to be really location specific, like say working on a circuit, what is needed for a particular circuit or a feeder or a substation, and some of it's going to be system-wide. We've heard a lot about distribution SCADA and DERMS. Some of this, when you get far enough down the road, you're going to need for your whole system. And some of these things will be treated differently, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment too. Quantifying the information required to justify the need. This is a very interesting one in my mind, because if you look at something like, say, a safety or a reliability thing, you know, the utility folks were talking this morning about once you get power flowing in two different directions on your grid, you have to redo your protections, your relay schemes and whatnot, because when that wire is laying on the ground and somebody touches it, you want to know that that thing is dead. So, I mean, that is a pure safety thing. To justify that, you probably would need a different type of justification, a different level of justification than you would if you were talking about something that is purely to enable some customers to integrate DERs. I mean, they're two completely different things. So some of the new functions, some of the new capabilities, these have been talked about a lot. I'm going to skip over a lot of these. Hosting capacity, locational value of DERs, projecting loads and DERs in a granular way. Actually, the wire space and the new wire or non-wire space, these have all been talked about. I'm going to kind of skip over these and talk a little bit about some of the other things. Specifically, articulating a benefit cost framework or metrics to be used. One of the examples that I just gave a moment ago, I would say that something that is a pure safety thing, you probably, when you see that distribution plan, as long as it's justified and as long as what they're doing looks reasonable, you're probably going to say, yes, do that. But other things, you might want to see a benefit cost analysis. At some point, all of this stuff impacts rates. And when you think about who is putting in solar on their roof, who is putting in backyard wind, it tends to not be low-income people, it tends to not be renters. So there are segments of your customer base that are vulnerable. So when you start investing in some of these things, you want to know that the benefits are going to exceed the costs, because in theory that means that it's going to benefit everybody, and that there's not going to be some people who are going to be left behind and paying the bill. So looking at some kind of a framework for analyzing these investments is important, and I think that's probably what I would call an evolving function for these distribution plans. Pricing, programs, procurement, and markets. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. That's also what I would consider to be a new and evolving function for the distribution planning and the distribution platform itself. And informing customers of some of the opportunities for involvement. You heard and you talked a little bit about non-wire solutions, online hosting capacity maps. There are ways that you can make this information available to people that would serve as an impetus or if nothing else, it would make available to them the knowledge that there is an opportunity that they could take advantage of to do something, building a storage facility or some kind of a backyard wind facility or something, and take advantage of this. So getting that information out there is a key and probably a new and growing function. So I'm going to dive into some of this a little bit more deeply now. Pricing, procurements, and markets. Probably shouldn't really talk too much about programs because I think utilities have been running energy efficiency programs, demand-side management programs for a long time. So I think we tend to know what those are. One thing I'd like to add to what we've heard earlier today that talks about energy efficiency and DSM as being part of what we're calling DERs is load management, the traditional load management that utilities have done forever, water heater, load control, air conditioner, cycling. We've tended to do that for energy, for generating capacity purposes, to offset capacity purchases, lower our peak demands. But you can do that for distribution capacity purposes as well. It would be a different load control paradigm. You'd do your load control differently than you would for generating capacity. But you can do it specifically for distribution capacity as well. Okay, so pricing. Some of the interesting things that are going on. We've heard a lot about Hawaii. I think the last time I saw a number for Hawaii, something like 18% of residential households had rooftop solar. So it is different than Ohio, clearly. It's a different situation. So they have a lot of solar that they're worried about integrating. They get power when they don't need it. They don't get power when they do need it. So they're doing a lot of interesting pricing things. As an economist, I find this exciting. I think I'm allowed to. Like if you give us power for these hours of the day, it's worth 10 cents a kilowatt hour. If you give us power in these hours of the day, it's worth 0 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're clearly targeting people that have some kind of generation and also some kind of storage so that it can be controlled that way. New York has been looking at market design. I'm not sure where this is at the moment because I haven't followed it as closely as I should be. But the question of low income has come up in a couple of different ways in New York. One of which, when they're looking at putting together tariffs, how much are we willing to pay for solar energy? Or how much are we willing to pay for DERs of one sort or another? They came up with what they call the value stack, which is to say, it's worth this much for the distribution capacity offset. It's worth this much for the generation capacity offset, and so forth, down the list of functions that DER could fulfill. So that gets you a number. But now the question is, if you want to provide incentives for people to do something with the low-income segment, maybe some sort of community solar or something. Maybe if you have an additional adder on there, you'll get that. Another thing that New York did that I thought was kind of interesting, and it goes to, I think, one of the questions that was discussed earlier. I don't know if it was Chairman Hawk's question or somebody else's, but at one point in a 2015 order, the state of New York PSC asked the question of should utilities own DERs? And I think they came down on the side of no, we think they should not. However, there might be some exceptions where maybe it would be appropriate, one of which was some sort of way of giving opportunities for some of the low-income or renter markets to have an opportunity to get involved in DER. So they're looking at some ways to do this, and this is a consideration that is fairly important, I think. California is testing some procurements using advice letters. It's another way, I think, of getting that information out there, and it's a way of getting information out there that everyone is familiar with. They've been using advice letters of various types for years and years and years, so people know to look there for information. They recently put out, by the way, a proposed decision where they referred to the non-wires alternatives and this advice letter procurement process as being their first to market in the grid modernization era. So hence the word markets. I think I'm going to skip forward now a little tiny bit and talk about some more things, some leading edge considerations. When we look at what's going on in some of the states that are doing grid modernization, what are some of the things that are just our considerations? I'm not sure if there's a right answer or a wrong answer to some of this, but what are we seeing? One of which has to do with transparency. One of which is a phased implementation versus shall we say, a one single leap, which is not to say I think you can leap to a modern grid in one leap, but just in terms of how you ask the utilities to file things and provide information to you. One of which, another consideration is a unique grid modernization plan versus the utility plans all having some elements that are standardized. I think that question came up in at least one or two panels so far today too. And then inclusiveness. I've probably already beaten inclusiveness half to death, but we'll go over it one more time. Okay, so transparency. Several states I've either read or heard from people within the state that utilities will come into general rate cases or other cases, like for a rider or whatever, and they'll lay out a capital improvement plan. And so you'll see little snippets of a distribution plan in this case or that case or another case. But they never ever actually see the whole package, never see it all in one place. And one of the things in my extra slides at the back is an order from the state of Michigan, where the commission approved 2 general rate cases for 2 different utilities, and in both cases said, and we approve your capital improvement plan for your distribution system, but frankly, we don't feel like we have the information to actually evaluate that. So they ordered these 2 utilities to submit distribution plans. There are a couple of other states that I could talk about as well, but we'll leave it at that. The thing that I want to point out is what happens when you have these distribution plans is you get a lot more transparency. People, when they show up in this general rate proceeding, people know why it's there, what it means, because they've got this background, they've seen it. They understand the assumptions that went into creating it. In some cases, they've had an opportunity for some input, some engagement back and forth before that distribution plan was finalized. But what it also does is it gives consumers, and I'm going to use that phrase that I just found out it's a bad phrase, third parties have the opportunity to propose solutions. If the third parties know there are issues out there that are being addressed, they can propose alternative solutions. And this gives the whole process an ability to look at more options and maybe choose different options than they might have otherwise chosen. Phased versus implement one leap. There are a couple of states that just basically ordered the utilities to submit full-blown grid modernization plans. And I summarized the order, the elements that the states asked for in some of my additional slides at the back. Other states are taking a more phased approach, and I kind of liked what New York has done. I think somebody had a slide that showed this slightly differently than the way I think about it. But in the state of New York said, okay, this is what we think distribution utilities are going to become, and they had this vision of a distribution service platform. And so then they asked the utilities to submit what they called an initial filing, and it was specifically to define where the utility is right now in terms of how they do their planning. In fact, their current 5-year capital plan was also required. But also, with that goal in mind, where are you? What would it take to get you to that goal? And it's specific to their utility. And then they had a second filing, which was actually a joint utility filing, where the IOUs in the state conspired to come up with some ideas for how they would address some of the processes that are going to be needed to get to this modern grid, including things like a non-wires alternative framework, the the locational benefit analysis and other things. So they took it in some steps, and I kind of like that, because the first filing really laid the groundwork for where these utilities are and what it all kind of looks like right now. And then they start looking at the modern grid. So unique versus standardized. So I just talked a little tiny bit about a process that's going to lead to these grid modernization plans all having some elements that are standardized. Another thing that they did in New York that was also pretty good is the joint utilities got together and put together a benefit cost analysis manual for how they would analyze some of these things. So when you start seeing that come through, it will all be fairly standardized. It's something to think about. I don't know if there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but it's a consideration. We've talked about inclusiveness, making sure everyone has an opportunity to participate. And I'm going to leave it here with some parting thoughts, which is that standard distribution planning still will be enforced with some additional pieces. The more open we can make the process, the more stakeholders can be involved. And finally, I think the leading states are really striving for some kind of inclusiveness to make sure that everyone can participate.
Okay, thank you very much. Jereme.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Christina has a video queued up. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Before that video comes up, I wanted to frame the conversation or frame my message. And I was asked by somebody about an hour ago what my one theme was for today. And it kind of got me thinking because I have a list of thoughts. But the one real theme for this is what we called the building blocks that you saw this morning that had a 1, 2, 3, 4 is backwards. The market is driving this. Everybody else is trying to catch up. So with that, if we can go to the video real quick, please. Just a quick video to show you what we're doing right now. So that video is a video we show at other conferences when we're trying to do sales pitches. But I thought it was important for you to see the same sales pitch we give the customers. And the customers are what's driving this market. The customers are what's driving everything that we do. We are 100% customer focused. What One Energy does is install what we call wind for industry projects, but essentially they are behind the meter, industrial customer wind projects. They range from 1.5 to 4.5 megawatts right now in Ohio, and we are the reason that in the last 3 years Ohio is #1 in the country in on-site wind. We've installed more on-site wind than everybody else in this state combined. I guess I have a clicker. So I only have one slide, and it's just a couple collections of thoughts to talk through to share some of how we view the conversation on the future of the distribution grid. So our customers know the price of power for 20 years. We give them 20-year locked-in fixed rates, not tied to inflation, not tied to anything else. Their price of power is written out right now in a contract. The reason that's important and the reason that that matters to this commission is that's what's driving the market. The customers have said, we want long-term security, we want long-term certainty, we want something else to happen. We aren't building wind turbines because it's fun. We're building it because we have a market for it and because we're able to make a profit doing it. And we're able to do that by saving the customer money now and money in the long run. That's what's driving the growth of DERs in Ohio. So the things that we really need and the things that will really help us, we need access to more information. There's been a lot of conversation about integrated resource plans, hosting studies, and everything else. All of those cost money, all of those take time, and I will not use any of them. My engineers will not use any of them. They have zero value to us. And that's not to try to put down everybody else having these conversations. I will tell you that we will not make a single decision based on those. And we're the ones deploying $100 million plus this year. What drives this is us getting the actual engineering models. So our engineers can look at those models and figure out how much we can add. Because it's not cut and dry. You can't just look at a model and say, oh, based on this, here's how much you can add. It's not how it works. We sit there and say, okay, based on the model, if we added it this way, what can we do? Okay, if we put some additional protection and controls, what can we do now? We run scenarios. We do all of the same engineering that they do. We like to think of it that when we turn in an interconnect application, the utility is checking our work. But the problem is right now we do that blind. We cannot get access to those models. We cannot get access to the models that they have. And by the way, it would cost absolutely nothing and take zero time for them to share the models they have right now with us. And those models should not be blanketly available. There should be some restrictions. You should have a bona fide use. In my opinion, you should have a customer endorsement. If you want access to that substation area's model or that distribution systems model, you should have a customer on that model saying, we'd like to endorse this consultant or this outside person to get that model. There has to be some security and some protection. I'll be the first one to say that has to happen. But if we can't get that, we do everything blind and guessing, and that takes a lot more time and a lot more effort. When we turn in interconnect applications, we've had times where we've had the utility come back and say, there's $500,000 in upgrades required. After we've actually gotten some of their work and been able to explain to them why we disagreed with their work, we were able to drive in that particular case that number down to about $32,000. So we have to have that material so that we can do a better job. Otherwise, we go through and argue with the black box. And a black box can be quite challenging to argue with. And then the other key to this is we need the ability to ask them to adapt their system to us. If the premise really is that this is a customer-driven organization, that this exists for the customer, then if that's the case, the customer is the one who really bears the risk. Utilities have rate recovery, that's great. But if they go down, some of our plants that we serve cost $1 million an hour to be down. $1 million an hour. And that's while they're sitting there with, in some cases, 1,000 employees not doing anything, waiting for power to come back on. So if we're able to work with that customer, whether it's with a DER or it's somebody else who's walking in saying, we'd like to give you a more advanced high voltage distribution system on your plant, we'd like to build in some resiliency, we'd like to use state-of-the-art technology, we'd like to do some of these things to help you have a more stable plant. And we go, okay, here's what we need though. We need the utility to adjust one setting change. And by the way, that setting change, we would not ask them to do if it wasn't safe. But a lot of those settings are arbitrarily setting curves that work, and this curve works, and so does this curve, and so does this curve. And right now, the customers have no formal process to push the utilities to make those changes. If you could actually tell the utility, here's the protection scheme we want, prove to us why it would be a problem not to do it, then you could actually get better quality power to that customer. You could actually let that customer and their engineers and the DERs and the outside consultants and the third parties, which I think I'm one in some cases, I'm okay with the term, you could let all of us help build a better grid that serves the customer better. And yes, we have to be connected to the EDU, but the EDU should have some duty to share information and to actually have a constructive conversation. Moving on to the idea of letting DERs help the grid. There is a new version of 1547 coming out. We're curious to see how that actually gets adopted and implemented. But the key to all of this is that's 10 years behind. I've been asking to be able to use LVRT and ZVRT for 10 years. At one point, one of our engineers was on the writing committee for 1547. That standard is always going to be behind. And that's fine. That's what consensus standards are for. But that's not how you innovate. So instead, it would make a whole lot of sense if we were allowed to approach the utility and say, hey, we've both agreed that we've met 1547, the version that exists today, the version that will exist in a year. We agree we've met it. We agree we're safe. Now we have some other things we can do. What if we turned on low voltage ride through and we gave you some more stability locally? I know you've got a voltage problem there. What if we did some voltage regulation for you and allow us to go ahead and negotiate a deal to get paid with that utility and allow those deals to be reasonable? Right now, none of us want to get off script on 1547. That's both us and the utility because of the way the laws and the rules are written. So if we were actually allowed to push the envelope together, maybe they could get the benefit that they needed at a lower cost, ends up saving everybody else money. So the next quote is not actually meant to offend anybody. It is meant to make sure that everybody understands the level of the distribution system today. The distribution grid is as modern as a phone book. I say that as somebody who spends every day with assets on the distribution grid working it, who gets the phone call from the customers. Actually, we get our own alerts from, because our systems are automated, and so we know when something went down, and usually we're out there with the customer when they're realizing that the power's down, trying to work through it, and we're out there talking to the utility, working with them to try to get back online. The distribution grid is significantly outdated. If you want to spend time and effort and resources, please don't spend it on integrated resource plans. Please don't spend it on hosting studies. Please do spend it on meeting some basic minimums of a modern distribution grid. Security right now is a joke. We all talk about it. We all say we should have security. We talk about cybersecurity. We also need to talk about physical security. Most substations are protected by a padlock. That padlock has no camera on it, no alert on it, or anything else. I would encourage them to start using alarm systems. I would encourage them to have cameras that they can go ahead and do remote diagnosis. If you took this camera that's right here, that's helping us give this presentation today, and put it in a substation, in more than half of the substations in this state, that would be a major improvement. Okay, and that, again, that's not trying to beat up how we got here. It's saying that if we want to get better, let's get better at the basics. Let's have physical security. Let's have cybersecurity. Let's invest in modern relays. Let's invest in being able to get fault files so that when there is a problem, they can remotely pull that fault file from their system operator facility. They can have somebody diagnose it before somebody gets out there to pull it. And they can say, okay, based on this and the fact that we've already got a really good model in SimDist or in Aspen or anything else, we already know that this had to be a fault right here. When we install our systems, we install state-of-the-art protective relays with them. So Schweitzer is a company that makes them. They're essentially really fast computers that monitor the grid in real time and make decisions. And they say, uh-oh, voltage is too high and it's now unsafe high, throw your circuit breaker. Everything that we do installs those systems. It's what same systems utilities use in newer substations. Those systems give us great data. They'll tell us where a fault was in most cases. They'll say the fault was a 4,000 amp fault with current going in that direction. If you pull up the one line, you can say, oh, okay, the fault was right here. Let's go ahead and isolate that network and get everybody else back online. Those should be everywhere. That's where the money should be invested. And again, until they have those everywhere and they have broadband access to them, we as DERs or other outside forces can't do a lot to improve things. It's very hard to improve systems that are still based on fuses. It's very hard to improve systems that have 30 or 40-year-old technology. And then in terms of two recommendations moving forward, 1547 is a complicated standard. We have the resources to have the engineering ability and to have the legal ability to know what our rights are, both technically and legally. We have the ability to force that. We actually have a very good relationship with the interconnection groups at all of the utilities that we work with. We're very proud of that relationship. But I will tell you that there are disagreements, and oftentimes they are good faith disagreements. If you are not us, with a staff of lawyers in-house, a staff of engineers in-house, and have been doing this for a while, those disagreements can be very, very intimidating. If you want to encourage new DERs and smaller companies, there has to be a more well-publicized, informal process to say, I don't think that's right or I disagree. Part of that's being able to get the data so you can challenge it. Part of it is likely having some ability through PUCO staff to formally challenge that without actually going to the level of filing something in front of the commission. We have to figure out what that balance is, but if the only chance to really have that debate is to file a full docket, that's a problem. If you're able to do something more informally with PUCO staff helping on a technical basis, that adds significant value and will make this a much more open market for everybody who wants to come in and try to compete. And then, again, lastly, to drive home this, distribution utilities need to be transparent. If their job is to be the steward of the public utility, which is how I understand their job, then it only makes sense that the customers they're serving have a path to get that information and a path to work through their transparency and say, what is best for us as a billion-dollar plant that's investing in Ohio to go ahead and make some widget. Ohio makes things. We have more industry than everybody else. Those customers all have sophisticated engineering firms they work with. They all have engineers in-house. They would love the ability to participate outside of their fence in what scheme what scheme their entire plant is dependent on. But right now, there is no path for that transparency. In one case, one of the utilities has a current policy that they do not give out protection and control settings at all. They will give you your fault current. They will not give you protection and control settings. You can propose something to them, and they will tell you if it works or not in their opinion. It's very hard to build and modernize when that's how you're dealing with a utility. That's something that needs to be fundamentally changed as the EDU becomes, in theory, the broker of power in between customers. And then finally, and I will stop then, I promise, there's been a lot of questions and comments raised about safety today with DERs. I take those personally. We are designing state-of-the-art facilities. We are using the best technology possible. We are using the best relays possible. We have the best security we know how to buy. We've helped companies that build firewalls build better firewalls to better secure our sites. We have gone above and beyond, and I would welcome a challenge any day of the week to put our security and our safety and our ability to detect faults and problems in the grid up against any distribution utility in this state. The problem is they won't even share the information for us to have that conversation. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Jereme, thank you. Aaron?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other commissioners and staff. So this is a challenge. As someone mentioned, this is the last presentation of the day. I probably could delete all these slides and tell some good stories, but we'll move on ahead. I'm pretty sure just about everyone brought up everything on this slide in one fashion or another today. Maybe not the same terms, but in terms of what we're thinking about with respect to what could distribution utilities be in the future? What should they be doing? What do they need to consider? This is probably just a short list because this doesn't even include the traditional stuff. This is the new things. Impact renewables. You guys can read English. And in fact, I've been taking notes on stuff that people didn't say that I'm going to cover at the end. If we toss in the resiliency challenges, which is really, in the last sort of in between smart grid and grid modernization, we hit resiliency. We had a couple major weather events. We have a couple different ways the system's being operated. This triggers questioning the processes by which we got to the systems that were there that either did or didn't react well to those events. And so once we toss in the concepts of resiliency, then you lead to behind-meter solutions, advanced protection and control, and this conversation we need to have in terms of planning and what that leads to. Our belief, at least at EnerNex, is utilities can start at the fundamentals and build from that. They're focused on safe, reliable, secure power. They understand how to do that for the most part, aside from the debate on security, which we could have. But no matter what their business construct is today, what you might approve in the future, they need to focus on what they know, what they don't know, and if they can figure those two things out, then they've uncovered what they don't even know they don't know today. So a lot of their processes are built around fixing the first two to make sure that the third one doesn't derail their business altogether. Wanted to give you a couple examples that have already been sort of covered today, but we know we can use radial solutions. We can build those up into loop solutions. And then when needed, we can build those into network solutions. And at the distribution level, those present different challenges, different investments, and different problems to the solution set and to the tools that are involved. Particularly the first one, we can all pretty much solve with pencil and paper. The second one is pencil and paper plus a connection. The third one gets more challenging. But there, the distribution engineers and the utilities can learn from their transmission departments who operate network systems. And in fact, many utilities operate those anyway. It's a distribution system. But you see there are some trade-offs. Some require more equipment, some require more communication, some can get by without it. That technical makeup will support or not anything that we want to develop. So if we want to put out electric vehicles, or we want to put out behind the meter wind, we want to put out any other solution that we're looking at from a planning standpoint, that the initial technical makeup will support it or not. So we know already that if we have perfectly sized system for today and what we think based on our planning works for today and maybe the near future, that will not help if that condition changes. And so we have to be able to adjust those investments and target how to change those investments. And that's a planning exercise which leads to pragmatic operational problems. So if we think about one-way power flow today, it doesn't help that it changed dramatically in the space of a year because we changed an incentive or the market evolved. We know we've invested a lot in smart meters and information and two-way communications. Keeping that locked in the metering department doesn't allow the planners to use that voltage information to improve their tools, improve their approach, improve their simulations. So that has to be unlocked within the utility. We also know, as we just heard, static protection settings don't help you at all. And in fact, a few of the utilities we're working with trying to get toward the future of distribution system operation and planning want to not just use the one settings collection in the relays. There's actually maybe 20 slots. They only ever use 1 and 2, normal and backup or emergency. They want to adaptively be calculating this as the system changes to account for the impact of DER throughout the day and be practically constantly reconfiguring the network. And what that leads to is a note I wanted to take that no one's brought up is there won't be a new normal in the future when we get away from single source, multiple sink distribution systems. The new normal will be whatever just occurred before the last contingency. If we reconfigure the network, where you come out of the contingency is your new normal. If it happens to look just like where you were when you went in, fine. If it doesn't, you need to adjust. So that's a different concept when it comes to adaptive protection and non-static use of static settings. We can't apply a process to fix the problem of what I don't know. This is an illustrative process. You'll notice it starts with model fixes. In a lot of cases, what's known about the distribution system is not as much as you'd like. And we saw one example earlier from EPRI where they showed how it kind of gets fuzzier and fuzzier the closer you get to the customer. We need to fix that. Once you fix that, you can leverage everything downstream of that. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. We can't let the perfect get in the way of the good enough. But once you do that, you can start building in the rest of the project. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Here's one example. Model fixes. It's really simple. You think you need a switch between two circuits. It turns out, without even leaving the office, there's already one there. We use Google Maps. I saw it in the picture because the car is driving by and updating that. So you can do that or walk the circuits. So you need to clean up the data, fixing what you don't know. Going a bit downstream in the process as a sort of the tail end of an example, you want to add PV into the system. What do you need to do? Well, you can do it a very prescriptive manner, thinking about planning, thinking about where it could go. This can be driven both from the utility standpoint or from the customer standpoint in terms of identifying the sites. But those studies can be done with enough data that allow you to understand the impact of that. So here's an example. There's an existing installation. There's 3 potential new locations or 3 installations. What's going to be the impact? If you do the work, what you find out is if you don't put them in, well, they're already there, so that's good. If you add a little bit more, the third one can be connected fine. If you do some system upgrades, you can get even more benefits. So maybe you can operate the system fine, but if you do some enhancements, which is what the planning will tell you, then you get even more benefit out of that potential installation. But this is all, again, driven by the data and what you know about the system and how it's operated. So I'm going to spend some more time on these last three concepts, the future role with respect to services and a few other pieces. This is a non-exhaustive list, and I'm going to enhance it, like I said, with some of the notes I've been taking. We've heard already, renewables have to be available for everybody. We want electric vehicles. We'd love electrification of the industry, not just for you and me. How about all the delivery trucks? How about all the over-the-road trucks? If we can solve that problem, then we can get rid of that reliance on fossil fuels, but we need to enhance our network because we're going to be plugging in those loads. Again, you can read. I'm going to talk about a FLISR application and what that leads to. I'm also going to talk about, with respect to electric vehicles, we heard earlier there's this issue around clustering. Well, those are mobile, high-demand loads and sources. It's okay today. We can probably account for a few of them pretty much anywhere in the system. But I want to think about maybe 10, 15 years from now. My kids invite me to go to a football game. We all have EVs. We're all there for about, if we're going to tailgate, 10 hours. Is there enough support at that site for us to all take our EVs and plug in and operate the electric grill, not the gas grill, to be there all day and still charge? Or do we need to be supporting the grid? Or how many of us will be doing that versus not? So the planning has to allow us to understand that clustering and potential uses we're not even thinking about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about applications. You could be a service provider. We tend to deploy devices that have 10 to 20 year life cycle. They have fixed operating systems, fixed firmware that we update once or twice in 20 years. How about we can deploy an app and leverage a different value out of those systems without doing a massive firmware upgrade across the system? So we're interested in just more granular voltage at a few meters, so we deploy a voltage app and just grab it out of those rather than having to go through a firmware upgrade. So can we build flexibility into the platforms that allow the planners to account for future uses without having to go through a different procurement cycle? In thinking through a FLISR process with a utility, we can start from the top and the bottom. It looks a lot like what you think. Power goes out, we find a location, we isolate it, we restore. But what they want to put in is dynamic rating calculation. As soon as the system is reconfigured, recalculate all the line segments in real time. Do a real-time DER forecast, which is really a load forecast both. So it's really an updated and modern forecasting engine. Adaptive protection in real time. Not only offline for planning, but in real time. Automatic switching and management. Still, it's okay to leave some manual switches out there, but how about automating that, putting out more and better communications and allowing that to occur in real time? And then making sure you have that full connectivity model back to the fundamentals. Do we have the information? If we look at having an advanced distribution management system, we touch on some other technologies. So we want that to operate the system, but that's often used as a planning tool as well. It has the ability to do simulations. It has the ability to do different types of calculations that enhance planning or substitute for planning. What that means is we need data. Lots of the data from the systems we've already installed or would put out. DERMS, we've heard DERMS mentioned today. Meter data management, we've talked about that. And that leads to, is the future of the utility being a data management utility? Maybe they should have a data management department that manages sub-second resolution data, second resolution data, sub-minute, minute, quarter hour, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly data, and be serving that up to the other entities across the utility and externally. We heard about the need for the external data. Unlocking that with the right precautions to allow people to propose new solutions or to help the utility in the future. One of the things that also comes up, and I heard somebody ask the question earlier, could you define grid edge or Internet of Things? So there's two pieces. One, Internet of Things technologies that communicate in a peer-to-peer fashion and solve problems for you without coming back to a central location, asking for permission or running a simulation and getting a response. So putting enough intelligence there to help the operator also leads to different potential uses for the future. The other example of grid edge was the Nest example you've heard today. Functions. That could be the owner-operator or just the operator. They said they don't want to be the wires company only. That's fine. But they're also able to do and provide an electrical network that's right-sized for existing applications, potential new applications, but also have a fundamental upgrade plan. Not just planning on demand, but already think about this for the future. There really could be providing as a function two-way communications for any device in the field. So we're not talking about application-specific communications. We're talking about a field area network that's application agnostic. It's built on standards, but it's application agnostic. This allows people to imagine and the planners to help figure out problems, because you don't have to be constrained by, well, this comms can only do this, so I possibly can't fix the problem. Don't worry about that. Obviously, a function of providing is distribution SCADA, and then offline program development tied to those simulations, again, based on the data. And then, in reality, real-time contingency mitigation. In terms of capabilities, the EDU of the future really is the center of excellence. These utility folks have the knowledge of the system. They have that model, they have that information, they know how to run the system without the tools. So that's really a center of excellence. They have all the data, once they can figure out how to share it, and they understand how to do this with the tools that they can procure or in conversation with the vendors or however else they can do it. They have the operational excellence to succeed, both in operations and thinking about how that relates to planning. So in a couple of places we're working, the system operators have the same seat at the table as everyone else at the utility. Someone said we can't count on the operators to handle multiple DERs. That's true today, but they need a tool to do that and the training to understand it. And you'd be surprised at how well they understand the system. And then, of course, they need that communications across the enterprise. And then they have that excellence as well to build and maintain the system. They understand it. They know how to do asset management. We need to just give them the tools to do that and make sure they continue to do that. Now, down to the couple controversial things. If we do some of this well enough, part of the business model can be a bring your own. How about somebody brings their own microgrid to the system? So they want to build a new factory. I'll bring my own system. I can help you out or not. That's a business arrangement. But technically, develop the standards and business plan necessary so that people could bring their own solution. So you don't have to build new lines. Non-wires alternative. A piece of that is, however, turn that internally. If you can specify it good enough for somebody outside the organization to do it, that means it's really well specified. Well, then turn that into a business opportunity internally. Don't necessarily let them compete, but give them the opportunity to think about it as, could they do it a different way, not just the traditional way. Actually, that might be my only controversial one. Yeah, I did cover the rest of the ones. Anyhow, thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Aaron, thank you very much. Questions? Who's got them? Mahila, please.
Jereme, this is a question for you. You mentioned the models that you had some frustration, getting those models from the utilities. Now, these models you were looking to obtain before the contract is signed with the customer, before the contract between you, the developer, and the customer. Are these conversations and these models sort of discussed before the contract is signed? And I'm not talking about the interconnection contract. Is this something that you need for your sales pitch?
So, thank you for the question. We like to not waste anybody's time. We like to not waste the public's time or the customer's time when we roll out a project. We like to not waste the utility's time. We get asked every day by companies, can we do a wind turbine at our site? Or how many can we do? And it would be much easier for us to be able to just say, okay, just request your model from the utility. Let us look at your model and we'll tell you right now you can or can't with no cost to anybody. Instead, we go through a very sophisticated guessing process to try to build what we think that model is, to try to get the metered data, to try to essentially recreate a virtual version of that to go, yes, we believe it's going to work, or we're a little bit concerned about it. And then we decide if we're going to move forward at risk or not. If enough of our indicators tell us that we know we're good, then we'll move forward and kind of say we'll figure it out as we get there. In some cases, we say, look, I don't know if the grid is strong enough that's serving you to actually take a DER here. So we aren't going to allow any further steps to happen until we go through the entire process. We would much prefer to have that model be able to run an analysis ourselves, take that risk ourselves and say, we believe it's good and we're comfortable taking this financial risk, and then announce a project, sign a contract with a customer and move on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. The Ohio's interconnection rules does have the pre-application report, and I was wondering whether you have ever availed of that, opportunity to get some information from the utility before you actually, get into the interconnection review process.
We have, most of that is the information that we use to informally get. Sometimes we don't even tell the utility we're getting it, and the customer's able to get it by saying they're doing an arc flash study and request copies of their overcurrent at the individual time, which gives us the same parameters. And so we're able to do some things like that ahead of time, but all of that then goes back to educated guesses as opposed to the actual computer model.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Jereme, just kind of generally and out of curiosity, you mentioned Ohio being a leader. What are the key drivers of that? Is that your existing relationships being based here? I mean, what has kind of driven that development here in Ohio specifically?
So the reason that we are in Ohio is because of the way that the net metering law was written in this state originally. So the net metering law in Ohio is unique to most states in that it was written so someone could offset their load, or whatever caveats we're putting on that, because I understand that case is pending, so I will not go too far into that. But most states picked a number, 20 kilowatts, 1 megawatt, 5 megawatts arbitrarily. Ohio said that you may offset up to your load. And all of a sudden, that means if you have a house, you can go up to the load of a house. If you have a factory with a 10 megawatt base load, you can go up to the level of that factory. Everybody has a fundamental right under that to design a system to allow them to not take power off the grid. That's why we came here. The reason Ohio is doing so well in on-site wind is because we came here and have invested in it because of those laws.
Dan?
This is for, I think, Jereme and then probably Aaron, maybe a little more than Alan. The question is, what do you want? And I think I'm hearing from Jereme that you want a more transparent situation so you can get access to information that you need to run your business. You also would like to have, I think, some sort of resolution process that's informal, or at least is not a litigated option. And what else is there that you're looking for? And then Aaron, I guess similarly, what is it that, what is there something? It seems to me, it sounds to me like you have some recommendations for us to pursue, or for us to consider, and what are your top several recommendations? So, Jereme, have we already taken care of, have you already gotten your kind of list of things that you want out, or is there more than what I just described?
Commissioner, I think you described it well. I would clarify that there's two areas where we see a technical process that needs to exist. One is on the interconnection side. The other is on actually pushing back and saying, we would like you to modify your protection and controls this way. And that isn't necessarily tied to DERs at all. That's tied to customers investing in their on-site distribution system, because customers run their own distribution systems as well. And when they invest in those and they want to be able to improve those, they aren't necessarily able to coordinate those with the utility. So the whole goal is to have a path to resolve that is a level of informality aside from let's bring the lawyers in, and try to actually work through an engineering process on both the interconnection side and on coordinating protection and controls. And obviously the transparency that you mentioned, Commissioner.
Thank you for your question. I think you asked for a couple of top recommendations. One would be to incentivize the EDUs to figure out the data and the granularity and the time scale of that data ahead of time, and think about that as it applies to their planning needs across the organization. So any new program should have a data component to that, and they need to think about how they could turn that into a service across the enterprise and potentially externally. That solves some of the problems that you've heard. I think the other piece is getting the business and technical standards in place to allow the innovation to occur driven from within or from outside. So that bring your whole device concept, whether it's a microgrid or a DER or a storage system or a wind turbine behind the meter or whatever, making sure that there's the right pieces in place that makes that, you know, both transparent but also easily understandable and feasible from either direction, or from any direction, really.
Thank you. Okay, couple questions. Alan, so you described what a few other states are doing. What pitfalls do you see? I don't mean to say it's an easy way out, but if we could have just said 6 months ago, hey, utilities, file a grid mod plan and we'll look at it, thanks, without really doing a deep dive into ourselves and the staff into the actual sort of substance of grid mod, okay? So from just purely the states that you've analyzed, as we sort of push through and start charting a path for the policy document that we're going to put together, what have you seen as some pitfalls that we need to avoid in doing that?
That's a rather interesting question. I think I would, as far as recommendations or thoughts, I think that I would like to see you go down a path of more standardization than anything else when it comes to some of the pieces that underlie these things. I do think that having all the utilities kind of, shall we say, agree at least on a basic framework for how they will be doing some things like benefit cost analysis, non-wires alternatives, so that when you do look at those plans and when the third parties look at those plans, if you know how to understand one of them, you know how to understand all four of them. That doesn't mean that they won't be different in terms of the absolute detail when you get down to it. Even in California, where they've been working for 2 years on these non-wires alternatives, as one of our previous speakers said, in the recent order, the California Public Utility Commission gave the utilities a lot of leeway as far as what they were doing within it. So they aren't going to be identical even when you get down to the brass tacks, but to have as much uniformity in terms of how they do it, I think that would be to everyone's benefit. I don't know if that's actually a
very good.
pitfall as opposed to a recommendation.
Yeah, very good. Jereme, so currently with 1547, if we were to allow for side deals to be permissible, currently with 1547, are side deals not permissible, or how do you navigate it?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As 1547 exists today, and I acknowledge there's a rollout coming and nobody's really figured out how we're dealing with the rollout yet. As it exists, I would not meet the test in 1547 if I were to do a side deal. For example, low voltage ride through. So I'm going to assume that not everybody has spent time studying low voltage ride through because you aren't, as much into that as me for having fun. Low voltage ride through says if the grid's going to have a voltage dip, so all of a sudden the grid has mismanaged a little bit and is having a problem, and voltage is starting to drop. Certain technologies have the ability to say, even though the voltage is dropping, I'm going to try to stick it out and try to put what I can, and in some cases even improve the grid for that brief moment to try to allow the grid to fix itself. That way, instead of having the lights go out, the lights may dim a little bit and come back on, and the grid has done this. The transmission system works this way. It's how the transmission system is able to correct itself. Under 1547, as it exists today, there's a minimum voltage setting, and if I hit that, I'm required to trip off immediately, period. So the problem is a side deal would make both of us not correct when we signed, us being the EDU and the DER, that we met the rules, because we can't meet the rules and do a side deal right now. And so right now, because we use standard forms and forms approved by this commission that say we've met 1547, we aren't able to balance the two at the moment.
Got it. On your point about the modernizing the grid itself, modernizing the physical grid itself. So one concern that I'm developing is in requests to allow for investment in the physical grid. Are we aware of whether or not there are, whether it's non-wires alternatives or different, better tech that would actually render the request for a physical update obsolete? And so, how should we view requests to update the physical grid in tandem with what we are sort of learning here with respect to the possibility of marketplace fixes to a potential grid difficulty? I guess there's a very I'm going to guess that your answer is going to be there's a very basic subset of investments that have not been made that need to be made that are even more elementary than what we're talking about right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with the answer. I think the key in this, and the reason I was very deliberate in using the phone book analogy, is if your staff came to you right now and said, Mr. Chairman, we need to have some phone books so that we can figure out where phone numbers are, you would laugh them out of the room. You would say, what do you mean you aren't on the internet? Or what do you mean you aren't using some modern technology service or there's not an app for this? At a very basic level, getting direct communication lines and getting modern computers, and in that I mean protective relays, that are full three-phase, 3CT, 3PT relays at every single substation, and frankly at any other control point they have, should be a no-brainer along with some of the basic security. I think beyond that is when it becomes a more sophisticated conversation where you have to both push back and say, okay, is there another way to do this investment with outside money or with private money or private investment? But I think that until you actually improve the base level foundation, it's hard to even have some of those conversations about what the outside will invest in. Does that answer your question,
It
Mr.
does.
Chairman?
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I follow up on your first question?
Yep.
Because I was actually wondering about the same point myself. If 1547, is it IEEE 1547?
Yes, sir.
If it remains in the new version with the same aspect that it currently has, which sounds like prevents you and the utility from doing what you would like to be able to do, then aren't you going to still be stuck in the same fashion that you are today? And is there anything, or is there something that you think we can do to help with that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The new standard does not make a lot of things mandatory. It makes a lot of things permissive. The issue is we aren't going to do a lot of things for free. So if we can add additional capabilities, we would also like to be compensated for those capabilities. Right now, I'm not aware of a mechanism to deal with that compensation with the utility because they are under their standard net metering tariffs. So I think that the real point is if there's a way to allow for the tariffs to allow by mutual agreement some additional benefits that they can financially justify, I think that opens the door to see if we can work together. I believe in a lot of cases we can work together. I don't know that it'll be all of those, and maybe in 2 or 3 years we come back and say we've had more disagreements. But right now, under the net metering tariff, they don't have an additional way to compensate us for that when we elect to use that tariff or our customers elect to use that tariff.
So you're looking for some additional flexibility in the net metering tariffing arrangements that we authorize?
Commissioner, I believe that's how it would probably have to be handled, but that probably becomes a legal question and where the jurisdiction or where the authority would have to be conveyed to allow them to make a non-approved deal on a one-off basis right now. And likely that would end up going through a rate case, and likely, by the way, that ties to once the new version is fully adopted. And so once everybody fully adopts it and everybody's had a chance to fully process it and start using it, and then adjust all of their interconnection processes and adjust everything else, then the question becomes, how do you put compensation into that? So if we can make a good financial decision, we will absolutely continue to make that good financial decision. The trick is making sure there's a way for us to be compensated for that. I think that was a complicated non-answer, Commissioner.
Okay. Dan, can I follow up on that? Let's take this down one more level of detail. So, at the moment going in, you've got 3 options. You can bring your the self-generation in behind the utility meter into the into the end user directly. And if that's the case, then we've got the problems that you've just described before about, what do we do in order to balance out the rest of the system. You could bring the power into the transmission system one level up, in which case I'm assuming you have to go to PJM then.
Commissioner, if we went to the level of actually bringing it to the transmission system, yes, absolutely, we go through PJM and wherever we were through the regular ISO RTO type scenario.
Right.
If we brought it in at the distribution system directly with the utility, which I'm assuming is where you're going with the third option.
That's where I'm headed. So go there right now.
Thank you, Commissioner. So if we do that, the issue is we wouldn't finance the deal. And the problem is we are doing deals with customers. We are completely customer-centric. The investment is customer-centric. I'm able to raise very low-cost debt to invest in the grid because we're customer-centric. The minute I start becoming grid-centric and then trying to work a deal where I flow power through the grid to a customer, the entire view of this changes. And so the issue now becomes I've inserted a middleman. What is the rules for that middleman? How is that going to change over time? Are they going to change how they compensate me in a year or two? And it's much harder to work a deal directly with that customer. So while technically what you're saying is possible, and that's where you will see things like storage-based DERs come in and say, let me solve a problem for you. And that, by the way, is a method that exists right now, where they can go broker a deal directly and say, we're going to do an edge investment or whatever to fix a voltage problem for you or a frequency regulation problem for you. That's a very real thing that's already happening in Ohio. The issue is, you're right, you have to either be behind the meter under one rules or in front of the meter under different rules, and you can't do both. And so that's what causes the conundrum for us in terms of how to get economic value for providing benefit to the grid.
Okay. So your interest at the moment is really sort of focused in on getting a different relationship on the behind the meter interconnection, so that you can, on a net metering basis, provide basically some support for the utility.
I just want to be a little bit careful on how I word that without trying to be cagey. Our goal is not to change the net metering relationship. Our goal is to say, outside of the existing net metering relationship, we can provide you with additional benefits. Would you like those? And what will you pay for them? And allow that to be an add-on on top of net metering.
But you weren't looking for a connection. This is where I'm trying to nail down that. Do you want a connection into the sub-transmission distribution system? But that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for be able to flow it through the if you will, the internal, starting initially with the internal system of your customer who's buying the.
That's correct, Commissioner. And to try to illustrate that a little bit better, I could make a few settings changes on our systems, and I could put 25 megawatts of low voltage ride through, zero voltage ride through, voltage regulation and power factor correction on the grid tomorrow with the systems I already have installed for my customers. Right now, we aren't able to do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. This question has to do with just an overall, we've talked about 1547, which is a little bit different than what normally comes up in these things. But I just want to know if this group this panel kind of agrees on what ought to happen. I mean, you've mentioned some ways to get there, what other states are doing that could make Ohio better. But, I mean, is there a, kind of a list or a kind of a basic, basic request or basic, hey, look, if you want to move Ohio forward, this is what you need to do. Here's the 5 things you need to do. And, we talk about a lot of these things all the time, but is there kind of a list?
Mr. Commissioner, I think the one thing all of us agree on is better information allows us to give better answers to that question.
Better data,
And so I
right?
think,
Or make it accessible?
Correct. I think that's the one place where, gentlemen, correct me if you disagree with me, but all of us completely agree that getting better data allows us to propose better answers and to do better things to improve the process. I think beyond that, we might all do different things with the data and have different views from there. I think there's some other things we probably agree on, but I think that the biggest unifying theme is share the information so we can help. Gentlemen?
Does anybody else have any comments?
I think one thing that you would make sure you want to take into account is it is often very either disconcerting or fantastical the amount of information technology expenditure that goes along with some of these systems. So if they come and say they want to do DER, they want to do a DERMS, or want to do an ADMS, the technical solution seems pretty straightforward. The amount of information technology change behind that can often exceed the technical expenditure for just the system and the integration costs, which leads back to the data and who's going to get it and what systems are involved. So I think definitely on the 5 things you would make sure you want to put into anything you do is encourage them to be very detailed and to really think about what's behind what they're asking for, because that leads also to a lot of potential cost overruns or project lengthening and then value that doesn't actually get achieved. And one of the ways I think about this is you could go back and do an examination of what were the business cases behind doing AMI of the first people that did it and then the second people that did it. And there are a lot of different reasons they said they were going to do AMI. And what often has been missing is that really cool technical paper or business article which shows we said we were going to get this and here's what we got. And a lot of times that's been missing, just that direct tie. We would reduce this many truck rolls. We would do this. We would do this. We would improve operations. The voltage would help our planning. We'd do better protection and coordination. A lot of times that secondary piece has been lost. And either they're filing it privately or, maybe they hope that no one goes back and looks at their initial case. So you need to also encourage them. Someone mentioned the metrics, right? What is it that they're going to put into their new program, and then actually go back and follow up and make sure that it's listed very openly so that it's very easy to follow. Because a lot of times that value justification is difficult to do from the outside.
One of the things I was struck by today, listening to a number of the presentations, really had to do with the fact that there seems to be a fairly lengthy interconnection queue, even though there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interconnection requests. And it kind of makes me wonder why it seems to take so much effort to get through the interconnection queues. I know that that's been a real point of struggle in a lot of other states as well. But the faster people get through the queue, I think the more people are going to want to do it. If I tell my neighbor that it took me 7 months to get my rooftop solar approved, is he going to be less interested in doing that himself than if I told him, yeah, it took 2 weeks? So, I think a lot of effort could and should be focused on streamlining some of that stuff.
Okay.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Thank you very much. Wonderful panel. Okay. Great day today. We will convene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Tomorrow's subjects will be, generally speaking, it is a distribution system operations day, and we will discuss electric vehicles up till about 3 o'clock and then storage after 3. Thank you very much.